fog rolled in earlier than usual that evening, spilling over the wooded ridges of Clearwater Hollow like an overturned bucket of milk. It crept with deliberate slowness, pooling in the empty streets and licking at the cracked sidewalks like it had a mind of its own. Ellie Shaw stared at it through the grimy window of Martin's Gas and Goods, her fingertips brushing the counter. The glass was cold, colder than it should have been. "It's getting thicker every night," muttered Toby, the wiry teenager she shared the night shift with. He sat on a stool behind her, scrolling aimlessly on his phone, the blue light casting shadows over his acne-scarred face. Weird, right? Like, too thick. Ellie didn't answer immediately. She was watching how the fog shifted under the flickering neon gas price sign, the way it moved, alive, almost purposeful. The cars parked out front were reduced to faint shapes, their edges blurred and uncertain. "I don't like it," she said finally, her voice low. "You don't like anything." Toby's smirk didn't reach his eyes, and Ellie noticed how his leg bounced nervously under the counter. The bell above the door jingled, making them both jump. A man stumbled in, his shoulders hunched and jacket damp from the fog. His face was gaunt, lined with exhaustion. "Just the essentials," he muttered, tossing a bottle of water and a pack of gum on the counter. His hands shook as he fumbled for his wallet. Ellie noticed his nails were dirty, the beds rimmed with something dark and crusted. "You okay, sir?" she asked, scanning the items. The man didn't look up. "Fine, just don't stay out in it too long." Ellie froze mid-scan. "The fog?" He nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing like it was trying to choke back something unspeakable. "It's not just water vapor, not anymore." Without waiting for his receipt, he snatched his things and hurried out, the door slamming behind him. Toby let out a nervous laugh. What was that about? Fog's just fog, right? Ellie didn't answer. She watched the man's silhouette dissolve into the haze, his outline swallowed up before he even reached his car. Later, just past midnight, the store was quiet. The hum of the fluorescents above seemed louder than usual, almost grating. Toby had wandered into the back to restock shelves, leaving Ellie alone at the counter. The fog pressed against the windows, making the space inside feel smaller, more claustrophobic. She reached for her coffee cup and noticed her hand trembling slightly. "It's just the cold," she told herself, but she knew it wasn't. Her phone buzzed, a notification from the town's community app. Curious, she unlocked it. A thread titled, "Anyone else hearing things in the fog?" had exploded with comments. "It's not just wind, it's like voices? I heard my mom calling me, but she's been dead 10 years. Stay inside, don't even look at it." Ellie's stomach tightened. She was about to scroll further when Toby's voice echoed from the stockroom. "Ellie, can you come here a sec?" Something about his tone prickled the back of her neck. It wasn't the usual cocky sarcasm. It was off, quiet, uncertain. She pushed through the door into the back, where rows of shelves cast long, thin shadows under the buzzing fluorescence. "What's up?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer. "Toby?" Ellie moved between the shelves, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the floor. At the far end, something shifted. A faint outline moved just beyond the corner, slipping out of sight. "Stop screwing around," she snapped, but her voice wavered. She rounded the corner and stopped cold. The back door was ajar, swinging gently. Cold air seeped through the gap, bringing with it the dense, cloying smell of wet earth and decay. Toby," she whispered. Outside, the fog churned. It was no longer stationary, no longer passive. It writhed, coiling and twisting like something alive, something breathing. A shape moved in the haze, tall and spindly, just beyond the threshold of visibility. It stood perfectly still, except for its head, which seemed to tilt slowly in her direction, as though it were listening. Ellie's breath hitched. For a long moment, she couldn't move. The figure was there, and yet it wasn't. It was more suggestion than substance, a shadow teased out of nothingness. "Ellie!" She whirled around to see Toby stumbling out of the storage room, his face pale. "Did you see it?" he hissed, his voice breaking. "See what?" "The man," he choked out, "in the fog." Her heart pounded as she looked back toward the door. The figure was gone, leaving only the roiling mist in its wake. "Close the damned door," she whispered, her voice shaking. Toby didn't need telling twice. By the time Ellie clocked out at 3 a.m., the streets of Clearwater Hollow were deserted, shrouded in that same suffocating fog. Her headlights cut weak beams through the haze as she drove home, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When she pulled into her driveway, she noticed something odd on her front porch, a crude drawing on a piece of damp paper. She climbed out of the car, her breath clouding in the frigid air, and picked it up. The drawing was smeared and shaky, but the image was unmistakable. A figure stood in the center of the page, its body stretched unnaturally tall, surrounded by jagged, curling lines that seemed to radiate outward like the fog itself. At the bottom, scrawled in uneven handwriting, was a single word: "Run." The morning sunlight did little to ease Ellie's nerves. The fog had lifted with the dawn, leaving only damp streets and the lingering unease of a night spent too close to something wrong. She stared at the drawing she'd found on her porch, now spread on her kitchen table. The crude figure in the sketch seemed to mock her, its jagged limbs radiating out like it was ready to reach through the paper itself. Sam, her 9-year-old son, shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mom, why are you staring at that?" he asked, climbing onto a chair. Ellie quickly flipped the paper over. "It's nothing," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just something I found." But Sam wasn't convinced. He tilted his head, his brown eyes narrowing. "It looks like the man from my dream," he said casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Ellie froze. "What man?" "The one in the fog," Sam replied. "He said he wanted to come in, but I didn't let him. You said I'm not supposed to talk to strangers." Her pulse quickened. "When did you dream that?" "Last night," he said, grabbing a piece of toast. "I woke up and the fog was at my window. He was looking at me." By the time Ellie arrived at Martin's Gas and Goods for her evening shift, her nerves were frayed. She hadn't been able to shake the image of Sam's small face, so matter-of-fact as he described the figure in the fog. Worse, she'd checked his window that morning and found faint streaks in the condensation, marks that could have been from tiny fingers, or worse, someone dragging a hand down the glass from outside. Toby wasn't at work that night. He hadn't shown up and his phone went straight to voicemail. Ellie's manager, Marty, hadn't seemed particularly concerned. "Kids flake all the time," he'd said with a shrug. But Ellie knew Toby wouldn't have just disappeared, not after last night. She spent most of the shift keeping herself busy, organizing shelves and restocking candy bars she didn't think anyone would ever buy. The store felt too quiet. Even the usual hum of the fluorescents seemed subdued, swallowed by the tension in the air. At 11:45, the bell above the door jingled. Ellie jumped, nearly knocking over a display of energy drinks. An elderly woman shuffled in, wrapped in a threadbare shawl. Her face was deeply lined, her eyes clouded with cataracts. "You're Ellie Shaw, aren't you?" she asked, her voice rasping like dry leaves. Ellie frowned. "Do I know you?" "You don't, but I know you," the woman said cryptically. "And I know you've seen him." Ellie's stomach dropped. "Who?" "The harbinger," the woman whispered. She leaned in closer, her breath sour. "The man in the fog. He's not a man at all. He's what comes before." "Before what?" Ellie demanded, her voice rising. The woman shook her head, her lips trembling. "He doesn't kill outright, you know. He pulls you in, strips you bare, makes you his. That fog isn't just mist. It's the space between here and somewhere else, somewhere worse." Ellie stared at her, the words slamming into her like a fist. "Why me? Why now?" The woman looked away, suddenly fragile. "Because it's always someone, and it's always worse before it ends." Before Ellie could press for more, the woman shuffled out into the fog, disappearing almost instantly into the haze. At midnight, the fog returned, denser than ever. Ellie locked the doors, flipping the sign to closed, and tried to focus on counting down the register. But the fog pressed against the windows, thick and suffocating. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows. Her phone buzzed, a single text from an unknown number. "Come outside." Her throat tightened. She checked the cameras, but the exterior feeds were static. White, endless static. Another buzz. "We need to talk, Ellie." Her fingers trembled as she typed back. "Who is this?" The response came instantly. "Toby." Her blood turned to ice. Toby. He hadn't shown up for work. He hadn't answered his phone. She swallowed hard and typed again. "Prove it." 3 dots appeared, then stopped, then appeared again. Finally, a single image came through. A photo of her and Sam at the town fair last summer. Toby had been there, snapping pictures for a slideshow. Her stomach churned. She shoved her phone into her pocket and grabbed the baseball bat Marty kept under the counter for rowdy customers. The back door creaked open. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. Fog billowed in, swirling around her ankles. "Ellie." The voice was unmistakable. Toby's, but layered with something else, something deeper and more resonant, like a second voice speaking just behind the first. A shape emerged from the mist, tall and lanky, its edges shifting like smoke. Toby's face was there, but it wasn't his face. His eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. His mouth didn't move when he spoke. "It's easier if you don't fight," the thing that wasn't Toby said. "The fog takes what it's owed." Ellie backed away, gripping the bat so tightly her knuckles ached. "Toby, if that's you, fight it. Don't let it win." The figure tilted its head, the motion jerky and wrong. "You don't understand. I'm already part of it. You will be too." The fog thickened, closing in around her. In the swirling chaos, she caught glimpses of other faces, faces she recognized. The missing townsfolk. Toby. Her breath quickened. And then she saw him. Standing at the edge of the mist, motionless, was the man in the fog. He had no face, only an endless void where features should have been. His body stretched unnaturally tall, his arms too long, his fingers curled like claws. The lights in the store flickered, then went out. Ellie screamed. Ellie's screams seemed to dissolve into the fog, swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. The darkness was total now, her breaths loud and ragged in her ears. She clutched the bat, her palms slick with sweat. The air was colder, almost wet, and each inhale felt like drawing water into her lungs. The fog seeped into the store, snaking along the floor and crawling up the walls. Shadows writhed in the mist, indistinct shapes that flickered in and out of focus. Somewhere behind her, a faint scraping sound began, nails dragging along metal. She turned toward the sound, the bat raised, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Toby," she whispered, though she already knew the answer. The scraping stopped. A voice, low and distorted, filled the room, bouncing off the walls and coming from everywhere at once. "He's watching you, Ellie." "Who?" she shouted, the bat trembling in her hands. The voice answered, almost laughing. "The harbinger." A sudden crash came from the stockroom, the sound of shelves collapsing. Ellie flinched, nearly dropping the bat. She backed toward the counter, desperate to find her phone, a flashlight, anything. But when her fingers groped across the counter, they found something else, a piece of paper, damp and cold. It was another drawing. This one was different, more detailed. It showed the gas station itself, surrounded by jagged lines representing the fog. At the center, a tall figure loomed, arms outstretched, claw-like hands reaching for a smaller figure, Ellie herself. Beneath the drawing, 3 words were scrawled in uneven script. "Don't look back." Ellie's body locked up, her muscles seizing as though the air itself had turned to ice. Slowly, almost against her will, she turned her head. At the far end of the store, where the fog was thickest, the figure stood. The man in the fog. His featureless face was tilted slightly as though studying her. He didn't move, but the mist around him churned, pulling toward him like he was its center. Ellie stumbled back, her voice caught in her throat. She gripped the bat tighter, the splintered wood digging into her palm. The man didn't move, but his presence pressed against her, heavy and suffocating. Behind him, the shadows writhed, taking on familiar shapes. She saw Toby first, his body twisted and wrong, his glowing eyes fixed on her. Then came the others, the missing townsfolk, their forms flickering in and out like images on a damaged screen. "You took them," Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. The man in the fog tilted his head further, an almost curious gesture. "No," a voice answered, deep and resonant. It wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the fog itself. "They gave themselves." Ellie didn't remember running. One moment she was frozen in place, and the next she was outside, the cold air biting at her face as the fog closed in around her. The parking lot was unrecognizable, swallowed by the mist. Her car was just a shadow in the distance, its edges blurred. She sprinted for it, the bat clutched tightly in one hand. The fog swirled and shifted, shapes moving within it, arms reaching, faces half-formed, whispers calling her name. "Ellie." She pushed harder, her legs burning as the car came into focus. Her keys were in her pocket. She'd checked 100 times, but as her hand fumbled for them, something brushed against her arm. She screamed and swung the bat wildly, connecting with nothing but air. "Ellie, come with us," a voice pleaded, soft and familiar. She turned and saw her mother, or what looked like her mother. The woman's face was pale and translucent, her eyes empty sockets. "You can be safe here," the thing said, stepping closer. Its movements were stilted, jerky, like a puppet on strings. With me, with them. No, Ellie spat, backing toward the car. You're not her. The figure's face twisted, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. He's already claimed you. You can't run. Ellie dove into the car, slamming the door behind her. The fog pressed against the windows, and the voices grew louder, more insistent. Don't look, don't listen. The engine roared to life, and she floored the gas. The tires squealed, struggling for traction on the damp pavement, and the car lurched forward into the mist. The drive home was a blur of panic and disorientation. The fog seemed endless, twisting the streets into a maze that defied logic. She passed the same broken street lamp 3 times, and every turn seemed to lead her back to the gas station. Finally, the fog thinned, and her house appeared like a mirage. Ellie stumbled inside, locking the door behind her. "Sam?" she called, her voice hoarse. No answer. She found him in his room, sitting cross-legged on the bed. His eyes were open, but he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the window. The fog was there, pressed against the glass, like a living thing. "Sam, come away from there," Ellie shouted, rushing to pull him back. But Sam didn't move. "He's here," he said softly. "He wants to talk to you." Ellie's blood ran cold. She turned toward the window and saw the man in the fog standing on the other side. His faceless head tilted, and for the first time, he raised one long skeletal hand and knocked. The sound echoed through the room, impossibly loud. Sam turned to her, his expression blank. "If you let him in, he'll leave us alone." Ellie shook her head, her vision blurring with tears. "No, I won't." The knocking continued, steady and deliberate. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The fog receded, pulling away from the window. Sam blinked as though waking from a trance. "Mom," he whispered, his voice small. Ellie pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly as tears streamed down her face. She didn't look out the window. She didn't dare. Outside, the fog was gone. Ellie clutched Sam tightly, his small body trembling against hers. She buried her face in his hair, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. The house was silent now, unnaturally so. She glanced at the window, expecting to see nothing but the faint glow of streetlights. Instead, she froze. Etched into the glass, jagged and unmistakable, was a single handprint. Too large to be human, its elongated fingers spread wide, the grooves of its palm glistening faintly, like the fog had left something behind. And as Ellie stared, a single word began to form in the condensation on the glass, written by an invisible hand. "Soon."